The Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau has cleared Law and Home Affairs Minister K. Shanmugam and Foreign Affairs Minister Vivian Balakrishnan of wrongdoing in the process of renting two Ridout Road colonial bungalows. Let's get to the point with Deputy News Editor Grace Ho. Grace, can you elaborate on what stood out for you from the report?
Well, two things stood out for me, and I think the first is the most significant one, which is that the fact that the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, or CPIB, was involved in the process. If you recall, on 23rd of May, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said in a statement that he had tasked Senior Minister Teo Chee Hean to look into it, but there was no mention at the time that the CPIB would be conducting an investigation. And what's significant about this is that it signals that the investigation has been undertaken at the highest level because the CPIB reports directly to the Prime Minister and has necessary powers to ascertain any corruption or criminal wrongdoing. And that process of discovery is a very painstaking one. In this case, even the ministers' wives would have been interviewed. And the second thing is the sheer level of detail in both the CPIB and SMTO's reports, which also reflects, I suppose, to some extent, a high degree of transparency. I can't recall the exact number of pages, but it's a blow-by-blow account of the considerations behind certain decisions and the sums of money involved, starting even before the ministers moved into number 26 and 31. In the case of number 31 Ridout Road, the property had been vacant for 5 years, and how Mrs. Balakrishnan came across it because she saw a for lease sign at the property. And the report also details huge sums of out-of-pocket expenses by the ministers to, in a sense, refurbish, the area to a livable state. So it was almost $62,000 in the case of a carport by Mr. Shanmugam, and an additional $400,000 for improvement works. And in the case of Dr. Balakrishnan, $200,000 for such improvement works. Not to mention all manner of flora and fauna that make it into the report. During a site visit, Mr. Shanmugam noticed thick and overgrown vegetation on an empty slope of land next to the property, and he expressed concerns to the land authority that this could pose public health and safety risks like snakes, mosquitoes, fallen trees. And SLA's view at the time was that the tenant's responsibility shouldn't extend to maintain the area beyond its property boundary, but if you wish to, then it has to be included in the tenancy of the property. Then SLA went through the extent of fencing the adjacent land within the boundary and bringing the land size, to more than twice the original size.
The report's release will raise more questions. So, what else remains to be debated in Parliament next week, you think?
Well, one part of the report mentions that in January 2017, Mr. Shanmugam asked the then Deputy Secretary at the Ministry of Law for a list of a few properties available to the public to rent. Obviously, the question is, why approach the Deputy Secretary, a civil servant, and is that the usual process? Then a year later, in January 2018, Mr. Shanmugam appointed a property agent to represent him for the rental transaction. Again, well, fair enough, the property had been vacant for some time, but why the year-long time lag? Then there's the method of valuations. Why use the built-up area to determine the property's valuation versus taking into account the entirety of the space when that's technically considered usable land? I mean, one plausible explanation could be the condition of the land. We understand that it's a hilly area with slopes and there's a lot of wild vegetation around. But this is something that people may even want to see the photos, or examples, with their own eyes. And finally, is it normal for the SLA to agree to fence the adjacent area into the property boundary, and therefore for the overall size to go up after refencing, just because, let's say, a tenant expresses concerns about pest conditions for the public? But I think what remains unequivocally clear is that Mr. Shanmugam did remove himself from the chain of command and decision-making processes. So he had informed the DS that he would recuse himself of any discussion related to the rental of the property. And he also instructed the DS to approach then Senior Minister of State for Law, Indranee Rajah, in the event that any matter had to be referred to him. There are also, other points that were raised in the report. For example, the fact that the minister didn't deviate from the general guidelines for the rental of such properties. But at the end, even though the rentals are comparable to black and white bungalows in the Ridout area as well as neighboring areas, there are some of these remaining loose threads that perhaps the public still wishes to be tied together, and that will receive further airing in the next Parliament sitting, which starts from July the 3rd.